Well, good afternoon and greetings, everyone. For those of you who don't know, my name is Eric Stevens, and I am the newly installed president of the Rotary Club of Raleigh. Your now past president, Jim Dorsett, is taking a well-deserved break. I see he's actually in the meeting today, but he can take a little rest from presiding and just enjoy a relaxing time knowing that he had to put in a good full year. So congratulations to you, Jim. Welcome to the first meeting of our new Rotary year. I hope everyone had a wonderful, safe, and relaxing Independence Day weekend. It's great to see so many of you here today, and we are looking forward to an informative and important program that we have lined up with Kandace Watkins, a Raleigh attorney who serves as co-chair of the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. You will be hearing more about her from Richard Watkins later in the program. So before we get started, let me remind those of you who have your smartphones handy, please take a moment to check in on your Facebook or LinkedIn page to the Rotary Club of Raleigh. That's a quick and easy way to help spread the word about our club to your friends. And if you happen to see any interesting social media posts over the coming week, be sure to like it or share it. And that will be a good way to help amplify the work of people like Valerie and Linda who put up that content. And now let me turn over the program to our new Director of Administration, Richard Watkins, for the invocation and the pledge. Richard?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This invocation, Desiderata by Max Ehrman. Music performed and recorded by Christian Fushi. Go placidly amid the noise and the haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence, and as far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others, even to the dull and ignorant, for they too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexatious to the spirit. And if you compare yourself with others, you may become vain or bitter. For always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. And enjoy your achievements as well as your plans. And keep interested in your own career, however humble, for it is a real possession in the changing fortunes of time. Exercise caution in your business affairs, for the world is full of trickery, but let this not blind you to find that there is still virtue in many persons strive for high ideals, and everywhere life is full of heroism. Be yourself, especially do not feign affection, neither be cynical about love. For in the face of all aridity and disenchantment, it is as perennial as the grass. And take kindly the counsel of the years, gracefully surrendering the things of your youth. Nurture strength of spirit to shield you in sudden misfortune. But do not distress yourself with dark imaginings. For many fears are born of fatigue and loneliness. And beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. For you are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive him to be. And whatever your labors, aspirations, and the noisy confusion of life, keep peace in your soul, be cheerful, and strive to be happy. For with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. Now, if you will forgive me, because the camera at this portion of the program will be facing towards a empty chair as I lead you all in the Pledge of Allegiance, which is to be given while standing up. So I will stand up and deliver the Pledge of Allegiance. So please forgive me because I will be off screen. So if you join me now for our country's Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And before I give it back to you, Eric, there is something that we used to do, but we haven't done it in some time since being on Zoom. And forgive me because I am not the best singer, but here it goes. Oh, beautiful beautiful
for spacious skies,
for amber waves of grain, for majesty above the filthy plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with
brotherhood
from
from sea to
Galilee. And
sea.
since we have everybody, ROTARY.
Why?
That's the end.
Hey, nice.
Welcome to President Eric.
Where you on, Kim?
All right.
All right.
Thanks for that great singing, and thanks for the wonderful invocation. Richard, I think I'm going to need you to come and give one of those before my hearing tomorrow to get me charged up for it. So thanks a lot. That was just wonderful. And somebody there's an opera singer joining us singing America the Beautiful there. So whoever that was with the lovely mezzo soprano.
Oh, you knew what I was singing. Wow, Eric, that's great. This is Evelyn.
Okay. Nice job, Sevelin. Yes, that was you, wasn't it? Okay. All right, I'm going to need an invitation to come hear you sing sometime, maybe at church or something. All right, thank you again. Now we have a few additional announcements. Let's start with the CART buckets. The need for Alzheimer's and dementia research hasn't gone away just because we were not able to reach into our pockets and drop money in the buckets. So please do it the virtual way and send Linda an email or type a note in the chat box right now indicating that you want to give some money to the CART buckets, and we'll deduct that from your next dues. Second, you should have received a couple of things recently via email. First is a memo from me and Jim that discusses our Rotary budget for the coming year and the fact that we have an adjusted dues amount reflecting the fact that at least for the first quarter of this new Rotary year, we're not going to be having in-person meetings or meal expenses. You should also have received those adjusted dues. So if you don't have either of those, let us know. And if you have any questions about the budget, about the dues or anything else, please let us know. As Jim and I said in our memo, we're aware that this is a time in which many are experiencing financial hardship as a result of the pandemic and the effects that has had on our economy. So we are doing our best to be mindful of everyone's budgets and to spend your money through the Rotary Club as carefully and as wisely as we can. But if you have any further questions about that, please let us know. Next, as you recall, we had a great celebration last Monday, which we recognized our Rotarian of the Year, Mark Hackett. We remembered Eric Elwood. We honored longtime members and those with perfect attendance this past year. So now we have 3 additional perfect attendees for the year. These are people whose final makeups were processed just after the meeting last week, and so we didn't get to recognize them, but we do want to recognize Mary Moss, Elsa Silverman, and Jim Dorsett. They had a perfect record of attendance in our prior Rotary year, and given the fact that half of that was virtual and half of that was in person, that's a great accomplishment, and we appreciate their loyalty to the Rotary Club. So everyone give a quick hand to Mary, Elsa, and Jim for their perfect attendance last year. Next, I want to put in a quick plug for our program next week. We're privileged to have Dr. Ralph Barrick, who is the William R. Keenan Jr. Distinguished Professor in the Departments of Epidemiology, Microbiology, and Immunology at UNC Chapel Hill. And he also happens to be one of the world's foremost experts in coronaviruses. And he's somebody who is as well positioned as probably anybody in the world to tell us where we are with this terrible disease. We want all of you to hear this important talk, but also this is a very good opportunity to invite friends and particularly prospective new members to visit one of our meetings. Hear a speaker who lots of people are going to be very interested to hear from and learn more about the Rotary Club all at the same time. So when you get that invitation, be thinking hard about who you might want to share it with. And then finally, you see on the screen there the committees of our club. As I mentioned in my remarks last week, we are having a virtual club assembly, technology permitting, on July 20th. And during that meeting, we are going to assign everyone who attends to one of these breakout rooms for these different committees of our club. And the director who heads those particular committees will be leading a discussion about plans for the coming year. As I mentioned, we really want everybody to stay engaged in Rotary, even when we can't meet in person. So this is a good opportunity for us to not only sit and listen to a program, but to really kind of get involved. So please, if you have not already signed up for a committee, or you're not sure which one you're on, or you perhaps want to change a committee, send an email to Linda, and she will get you assigned to the right place. With that, let me turn over the screen to our President-elect, Charles Edwards, for a report on a special delivery that he recently made. Charles, the screen is yours.
Thanks, President Eric. Good afternoon, everybody. The district was able to secure a variety of items of PPE, including the masks. You see a picture of that there, as well as hand sanitizer, gloves, that we decided when it was all said and done, we got 12 large bottles of hand sanitizers, a box of gloves, and some masks, that we would donate those to the Salvation Army. So on July the 1st, I took over our items, hoping that we could give them more because they were in desperate need, but at least they got something. The masks themselves, as you can see, have the Rotary emblem and District 7710 embroidered on them. And we've decided that instead of giving those away, we did give 5 to the staff, senior staff at Salvation Army, that we would sell the remainder. There's about 35 of them, I think, left. I bought 2 already. And then use the money to either buy additional items or to donate to a charity that the board has yet to determine. We've decided to price the masks at $20 each, which is a little bit below the average of masks that you can buy online. But of course, this is for a good cause. If you are interested in purchasing them, please send an email to Linda. You can send one to me, but I'm going to forward it to her. And then we'll figure out how to do the payment. But I really encourage everybody to buy a mask. We need to be buying masks. I just did an analysis this morning, and the infection rate here in North Carolina is well above the US average. Unfortunately, we're not quite as bad as Brazil, but we're getting there, and we just need to demonstrate as good Rotarians wearing masks wherever we are in public. So that's my report. Thank you.
Excuse me, Eric.
Yes.
Before we continue, and thank you, Charles, we do have some guests for you to introduce, and Braxton Wilson also would like to make a Happy Dollars announcement.
Okay. Well, let's start with Braxton and your Happy Dollars announcement.
Hey,
Braxton, if you
how's
can.
everyone doing?
Yes, good.
So, my wife and I just celebrated our 8-year wedding anniversary on the 30th. And we found out some big news that we are going to have a little baby girl January 4th. So, in an effort to celebrate 8 years of marriage and our first child, I'm going to donate $100 per year we've been married to the club.
Thank you, Braxton.
Congratulations, Braxton. That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, thank you. Very
Congratulations.
excited.
And for our guests, I know that David Forrest has a guest, and David, I'll leave it to you to introduce your guest.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Eric. Yes, my guest today is James Montague. Monty and I have known each other through real estate and other kind of various groups for almost 20 years now. He is a Raleigh native who started out cutting hair, and I think as a teenager, very, very young, went on to have his own barbershop, and then went on to own the building that the barbershop was in, and then went on to build other buildings and shopping centers and senior living facilities and things. He and I had lunch last week, and we were talking about Rotary and how it pairs up well with the volunteer work that he does both here locally and in Africa. So hopefully everybody will have the chance to meet Monty in person at some point very soon.
That is great, and welcome, Monty. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you come back next week and the week after that, and we see a lot of you. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for welcoming me and joining me in. Thank you.
Great. And Richard, would you like to introduce the person who's associated with our speaker?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have to admit that I am of multiple minds right now. On one hand, I'm very excited and honored and privileged to be stepping into this leadership role within the oldest civic organization in North Carolina. And to make it even more special, it's on the Monday following the birth of our nation, the weekend that we celebrated the birth of our nation. But I have to also say that it's also a bit solemn because today I also celebrate the birth of the most amazing person that I have ever known. My mother passed away 4 years ago, and today I celebrate her birthday. She would have been 60 years old today. So I figure, what better way to kind of bring all of these magical elements together, the celebration of an amazing woman who made it possible for me to be here right now, the celebration of an amazing nation, regardless of its flaws and faults, of an amazing nation that allowed me to be here right now, by bringing in the second or third, we can argue with my wife, amazing people that I know, and my sister, Kandace Watkins. I've known Kandace her entire life, as it goes with younger siblings, and the majority of my life, with her being 4 years younger than me. We were both born in North Carolina, Tyler, Texas. And then we moved to North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina. Kandace went to Grimsley Senior High School in Greensboro, North Carolina. From there, she attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she was a journalism major. Following that, she went to law school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Following completion of her JD, she completed the bar, North Carolina bar, and served a clerkship under Judge Irvin on the North Carolina Supreme Court. From there, she went, and I always blank on the name of the law firm, but Kandace will come in and save me later. But
Young, Moore, and Henderson.
Young, Moore, and Henderson. Please forgive me, everybody. Young, and Henderson. She was able to do some fantastic work there. She visited our club while she was still an attorney at Young, Moore, and Henderson. And now I just want to get the title right. So, Kandace isn't furious with me. I'll tell you one thing, even though she is my younger sister, I look up to her, and the last thing I want to do is disappoint her. But now she serves as Assistant General Counsel at Self-Help Credit Union. And she also serves as chair of the board of directors for the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And without further ado, it is my distinct honor and privilege to proudly introduce to you my little sister and role model, Kandace Watkins.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen, or at least attempt to. Okay. How do we do full screen in
the upper right corner where it says present? Right next to the share.
Okay, got it. Thank you. All right, so thank you all for having me. I'm here with Carrie Ann Fisher, who's the Executive Director of North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And since I got a wonderful intro, I want to provide an intro for Carrie Ann as well. Like I said, she serves as our Executive Director since November 2019. One of my initial jobs when I took over the role as co-chair of the board was finding and hiring an executive director, and we brought Carrie in from actually my birth city, Tyler, Texas. It's kind of ironic that that's where she's coming from. So we had that Texas connection a little bit. She received her BA in English Literature and her MSW with a concentration in Women's Studies from Washington University in St. Louis. She began her career as a weekend advocate at a shelter for domestic violence survivors in St. Louis, Missouri. Carrie Ann was part of the team of the largest private child welfare agency in Illinois for over 16 years. First in the direct service as a family counselor and program serving youth who ran away from home or were locked out of their parents' home in Southern Illinois, and later as a training coordinator. Carrie Ann's experience also includes serving as a human resources manager for a skilled nursing facility in suburban Chicago, as a field consultant for the University of Chicago, and as director of training for Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. Before coming to NCCADV, Carrie Ann served as the first executive director for TheraPet Animal Assistant Therapy in Tyler, Texas. Thank you both. Thank you for having us both. We are going to be talking about domestic violence as we are representing the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we want to start our presentation with a little bit of just domestic violence 101, just so we can all work from the same vocabulary and have the same base knowledge and understanding of domestic violence. And then Carrie Ann will take over and talk more specific facts and figures, as well as specifically what the coalition does to help eliminate domestic violence in North Carolina. This first slide is a standard definition of domestic violence. It reads, domestic violence is a pattern of unintentionally violent and/or controlling behavior used against a spouse or a dating intimate partner to gain power and control over that person during and or after the relationship. Domestic violence is also known as intimate partner violence or dating violence. The green highlighted words are very important because it's what makes domestic violence unique compared to other forms of violence. Pattern, power and control, enduring and after are key words that make domestic violence unique and particularly problematic and insidious to address. What's missing from this definition are words that we might naturally think about when we think of domestic violence. The words violent are not included in this definition. The word abuse is not included in this definition because it's highlighting that there are other forms of power and control that can perpetuate domestic violence in a relationship. And so that's the key to domestic violence, is power and control. It doesn't always manifest itself in physical abuse that we might be familiar with, but it can manifest itself in a lot of insidious and problematic ways that we will touch on later. But as you continue to learn more about domestic violence, or even start analyzing and scrutinizing things that are happening in your own life and in your own world, the power and control piece is critical to understanding domestic violence. Here's some stats. Every 9 seconds in the United States, a woman is assaulted or beaten. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by their intimate partner in the US. And during 1 year, this equates to 10 million people. And as I read through these statistics, I've done this so many times that sometimes the numbers lose their significance, but I hope as you're listening to these numbers, you're recognizing that this is a staggering amount of folks. These are folks in our communities, folks that we know, folks that we're close to. And so to think about the fact that 20 people per minute are experiencing physical abuse at the hands of someone whom they have entrusted to protect and take care of them is really problematic. And that's one of the reasons why I'm committed to this work, because I do think it's critically important that we live in a world that's free from violence, and that we are creating a world in which families and partners can be healthy and happy together. Intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crime, and 19% of domestic violence involves a weapon. These numbers can be even more salient when we think about the diverse population in America. These numbers can increase when we think about communities of color or low-income communities. So even with these averages being as staggering as they are, imagine it being multiplied among certain populations in this country. Some additional statistics: 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. This includes a range of behaviors from slapping, shoving, and pushing, and also some behavior that we might not consider to be domestic violence. But another thing to note with this statistic is we see 1 in 3 men and 1 in 4 women, but it's also important to recognize that about 50% of domestic violence go unreported. And so actually this number can be doubled even when we think about the folks who have not reported their abuse. Also, we know that it takes about 7 to 8 times for a victim of abuse to even seek services. And so even after the data comes out and we're able to get these statistics of reporting, oftentimes we're getting a report after years of enduring abuse, and we're not getting reports from dozens and hundreds of people in this state. 43.9% of North Carolina women and 19.3% of North Carolina men experience intimate partner violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and or stalking in their lifetime. Again, this is a staggering figure when we think about almost 50% of women in this state will be experiencing some form of physical violence or stalking or sexual violence. Given that about 50% of women will experience domestic violence in her lifetime, we can probably look to people in our own circles, in our own world, who might have endured some level of domestic violence. And so it's important to keep that in mind as we have these conversations in our communities, and as we are interacting with folks in our community, is understanding that a lot of folks are dealing with crisis and trauma that we might not even be aware of. And so who are the victims? Based off of this slide, pretty much any and everybody can be a victim of domestic violence. obviously. It knows no gender. It knows no gender identity. It knows no age. It knows no race or ethnicity. It knows no immigration status or disability status or economic status or religion, or it knows no bounds. It can affect any and every community. However, what makes domestic violence so unique and so problematic is that while it can affect any individual or any group, it affects certain groups and certain individuals to a larger degree and to a more significant degree. For instance, we know women experience domestic violence at a greater rate than men. We know people of color, particularly Black folks, experience more severe and more frequent domestic violence than white counterparts. Queer, particularly transgender folks, experience a high rates of domestic violence while also not feeling that they have the place to report their domestic violence to law enforcement. Similarly, immigrants experience high rates of domestic violence, and their immigration status can be used to further the power and control. And so when we think about all these different victims and all these different segments, actually what makes each group unique is also what presents a unique barrier to living a life free of violence. So people who abuse, most abusers are violent only with their partner. The only exception is an abuser who is physically abusive to his or her children. Abusers are often are very charming. They're leaders in the community, successful business people, and famous stars. Outsiders find it hard to believe that someone with this status would abuse, and the victim finds it more difficult to get assistance or even call for police. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that while abusers are often charming leaders and successful people in communities, victims are also charming people and are also leaders in their communities and successful business people and famous stars, people whom we would not expect to live in crisis and live in abuse do. And so again, this is just something to be mindful of as we are navigating our community and navigating this world. Some folks whom we think are very charming and well-intentioned could live a totally different life behind closed doors. And so I think it's important that we at least be mindful of what we say when we're in certain settings, and just, make sure folks feel safe and comfortable no matter who they are or what position they're in to come and disclose if they feel compelled to. And I'd like to also point to this last sentence about it being difficult to get assistance or even call the police. I think that is, very difficult for a lot of folks who endure abuse. It's oftentimes not the first thing to do is call for law enforcement assistance when a victim has experienced domestic violence. And I think that is even more true for folks who do have maybe a distrust in law enforcement. This can be communities of color or undocumented communities. This can also come into play where folks have, this sense of not wanting to call law enforcement on their partner because they're in love or their partner is parenting their children. So there are a lot of factors that go into play as to why victims may or may not seek assistance or may not call the police. But I think that's why it's important for us as community members, as people who are leaders, to be a safe haven for folks in our communities and in our spaces and in our offices. If they have no one else to confide into, if they have no one else to report to, we should all feel like we have a responsibility to be stewards of goodwill and support our community members, even if they don't feel like they have support from other entities. The effects of drug and alcohol. Sometimes abusive relationships can involve drugs and alcohol. Both the victim and the abuser may attribute the abuse to drugs and alcohol. However, alcohol and drugs are not the cause of abuse. It is important to remind victims and abusers that it is not a cause for abuse. If an abuser is drinking or using drugs, injuries can likely become more severe. And with regard to drug and alcohol use for victims, it can be a means of coping with violence. And so again, if there are folks in your life or in your communities whom you might recognize they have an increased dependence on drug and alcohol use, it might be just worthwhile just letting them know that you're there and that you can be a resource to them. But absolutely, it's definitely not a cause or a reason for one to experience abuse. Leaving the abuser. Victims leave an average of 7 times before they have permanently left their abusive relationship. Every time the victim has courage to leave the abuser, the victim learns something about their ability to survive outside of the relationship, which again is very, very critical when we talk about domestic violence, because it is all about power and control, and the abuser will use whatever means he or she has to make sure they have power and control over their victim. And so it's critically important for abusers to feel empowered, feel that they can survive and that they can gain power and control over their own life. That is what's key for leaving an abusive relationship. By offering a consistent response, we can help the victim make a decision to get out of a dangerous situation permanently. It is very important for community, family, and friends to be as empowering and as consistent as possible. We've all made mistakes time and time again, and I'm just so thankful that even if I've made a repeat mistake, there are people in my life who have forgiven me, who have given me grace. And I think it's important that we do that with folks who are leaving abusive relationships. I think the one thing about abusive relationships that make them unique is that they're relationships. And oftentimes the victim is married to his or her abuser, loves his or her abuser, has children with his or her abuser, is financially dependent upon his or her abuser. And so leaving is not easy, but it's important for us to just give grace as much as we can and provide services and resources as best we can. Abuse tends to increase in frequency and severity over time. However, a victim is at the greatest risk of being killed when he or she is trying to leave their relationship. In fact, 75% of domestic violence murders occur when a victim is attempting to leave his or her abuser. And I think that's a scary statistic. We often ask, why doesn't he or she leave when we hear stories of domestic violence? And the survivor knows the relationship better than any outsider does. And the survivor knows that their attempt of leaving is when their life is most at risk. Again, domestic violence is about power and control. And when the abuser knows that he or she is losing that power, they're going to assert whatever means they can to regain it. And oftentimes that can be violent and dangerous and deadly. So, there are many reasons why it's tough for a survivor to leave, but knowing that their life is most at risk when they do leave is a very important reason why they don't. And I am going, a couple more slides I'm doing. So here are some North Carolina specific statistics that I think most folks on this meeting would be interested in knowing. This is data collected from just one day in 2019. 61 out of 85 domestic violence providers in this state participated, and over 1,700 victims were served. 26 domestic violence calls were placed on our hotline per hour. This is just over one day. There were 125 unmet requests for services, 69% for housing and emergency shelter. And a common refrain from survivors was, I know I can survive being assaulted, but I don't know if I can survive my kids being homeless. And this presents the issue that North Carolina is facing right now, and that we are experiencing a high rate of domestic violence, particularly in light of the pandemic. We're seeing an increased rate of domestic violence, and that is due to a lot of factors. However, resources are dwindling. Shelter space has already been very, very limited, and it's even more limited now. And oftentimes survivors are having to weigh living in abuse versus just living in a home with a bed. It's a very sad and sobering factors that survivors have to weigh, but this is the reality of North Carolina right now. And this is a power and control wheel. Those are some words that you have heard me say a lot throughout this presentation: power and control, because that is what drives domestic violence. And all of the outer portions of this wheel highlight different means abusers use to assert power and control over their partner. Using intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, denying, minimizing, and blaming, using children, using gender privilege, using economic abuse, using coercion and threats. And then the physical and sexual violence is the outer ring. And that oftentimes, you know, abusers will use any of those tools to assert their power and control. And oftentimes the physical and sexual violence is what manifests after or later in the relationship as the abuse becomes more severe over time. However, the power and control patterns are noticeable even prior to the sexual and physical violence coming into play. And oftentimes these other means of power and control are a little bit more difficult to recognize. It's a little bit more difficult to recognize that you are being isolated when your husband just got a new job and you have to move to another city where your friends and family aren't. You might not think that that could lead to an abusive relationship. However, it can be used as a means to control and assert power over a victim. And so here are some warning signs for folks to think about as they interact with folks in their community, as they interact with folks in their churches, their schools, their workplaces. Does the victim have unexplained bruises, headaches, scratches, or injuries? Does the victim have fear of their partner? Does the victim experience that their partner is checking in on them and their behavior and demanding to know where he or she has been, or are they acting jealous and possessive? And finally, do you recognize the victim is apologizing for their partner's behavior to you and others? And while these are not glaring red flags that someone you know is in an abusive relationship, these are however warning signs, and it would be safe and appropriate as a friend, as a individual whom you work with, to just be mindful of those things and make sure that that individual knows that you are there for them and that you can provide some resources to them, which we will also explain later when Carrie Ann takes over and starts talking about more of what NCCADV does specifically in helping survivors. Additional warning signs include giving up things that were once important, showing signs of sudden change in appearance or behavior, changes in mood or personality, and recent signs of alcohol and drug use. And oftentimes, you know, we see this behavior when we talk about depression or anxiety, which can also manifest itself after a victim has experienced some abuse. And Carrie Ann will take over with why do victims stay. Do I need to stop sharing my screen?
No, you can still share it unless she needs to. You're fine.
It's okay. If you can do it, Kandace, I'll just let you know when to advance, if that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you again for having us here. When I was in high school, I was a student of the month for Rotary Club, so have the soft spot in my heart for Rotary. One of the questions, and Kandace talked about why do victims leave, I think it's important for us to also look at why do victims stay. And part of the reason why I think that's important, we always try to be cautious about blaming the survivor for the abuse that they experience. But part of what we also want to remember is that part of how we can help survivors seek safety is by addressing the reasons they stay. And bridging any gaps and needs that they have that would occur if they were to leave. So, Kandace, next slide, please.
Oh goodness, of course. Were you playing a YouTube video coming up?
Oh no, you can skip that.
Okay.
We're not gonna do that.
I am so sorry. Okay.
So here's a list of some of the reasons why victims stay, and Kandace talked about some of these. It includes things like they blame themselves for the abuse they experience. Hope is listed because it's kind of two sides of the same coin. There's the hope that things will get better, and then there's also the loss of hope that things would ever be different. Promises of change, fear of being alone. And Kandace touched on something really important that a lot of times people forget when they're thinking about domestic violence, which is it started with a relationship. And so there's frequently love there. At times from the abuser to the person being abused, and certainly from the person who's experiencing the abuse frequently toward their abuser. Children are pets. This is a huge thing that a lot of domestic violence providers have started addressing is pets. There were frequently children's programs that would allow children to come into shelter and into services with survivors, but what do you do with your dog? And what if your kids are really attached to your cat? Or you are as a survivor. And there's now a movement for a lot of shelters to have kennels and other places where pets can be so that they're not leaving behind and feel safe. And Kandace touched a little bit on COVID-19 and how some areas are seeing increases in domestic violence calls. And part of that is, if you saw on the power and control wheel and you see listed here, isolation. When part of how we're keeping ourselves safe is isolation, that tool becomes increasingly powerful for an abuser who is attempting to control their victim. So it becomes harder to bring the behavior out into the light. It's harder to reach out to people for assistance. It just magnifies things. So not everyone during stay-at-home orders were safe at home. It didn't feel safe for a lot of people who were experiencing domestic violence. Next slide, please, Karen. So part of the question is, what do we do as a society and what is the impact? And I think it's important to look at the monetary impact, the impact it has on us as society and also as employers or coworkers. So a big piece is that there are $2.1 trillion in direct medical costs, 1.3 trillion in lost productivity, 73 billion in criminal justice costs, and 62 billion in other costs, including property damage. It has a high impact financially. Next slide, please. So it includes things like $5.8 billion per year, of which 4.1 billion is for medical and mental health services. And there's a detailed list of some of the ways in which funding is used in the number of millions of dollars of paid work because people miss work as a result of domestic violence. So it has a huge impact on the workplace. Next slide, please. Also, economically speaking, Kandace shared a little bit about economics being part of the way power and control is exerted. It's also important to look at what those ways are. So for example, an abusive partner can often restrict access to money. A lot of victims are in a situation where they're given almost an allowance for household needs. Credit is sabotaged, so large bills can be run up and make it so that the person who is experiencing abuse is unable to leave as a result of having bad credit. The same can also be true with fraud and coerced debt. Personally have encountered a situation where a woman's husband put all the bills in her name and then didn't pay them so that she would then be unable to establish electricity in her own name and made it harder for her to leave. Next slide, please. So another thing as a society that we can do is look at the language we use. So there are times when we use language like an abusive relationship or a domestic dispute. But one of the things we try to look at is the fact that the relationship wasn't abusive, the abuser was. So to make sure that the person who committed the offense is not invisible, that we acknowledge there is an abuser. And domestic dispute, one of the things we talk about is we don't call a mugging or a robbery a money dispute. So we want to make sure that it's clear that it is a criminal assault. It is not something even-sided or just a dispute where there's a discussion in a parking lot somewhere. It's more serious and dangerous. Next slide, please. So here are some examples from the area where the term domestic dispute was used in a news story. An infant dropped twice during a domestic dispute. Murder, suicide related to a domestic dispute. Next slide, please. And then domestic disturbance sometimes gets used, and this was in Connecticut. 10 police officers injured in an explosion, but it's a domestic disturbance. That takes away from the danger and the dynamics of what actually the woman in this case was held hostage by her husband for 3 days. It's a bit more than a disturbance. Next slide. So one of the big questions that most people ask us is, what do I do if a friend or family member is experiencing a situation like this? And there are some pretty simple common sense things to do. One of the first things is acknowledge that it's a difficult situation and that it can be frightening. It's helpful to be supportive and listen. To be non-judgmental, a lot of times we think about, well, I wouldn't stay in that situation, or I wouldn't allow that to happen to me. And that's a natural instinct that a lot of times we have when we hear about something, but it's not helpful to the person who has experienced it. The most helpful thing we can do is be supportive and non-judgmental. It's important to understand that just because a victim may walk away from a relationship, may end the relationship and leave, that they're going to be fine, that point it's resolved. Because again, as Kandace said, it frequently isn't safe after they leave, and if they've been experiencing a long period of isolation as part of power and control, they really need those connections. They really make a difference to long-term lasting safety for a survivor. And that's part of the reason why it's also helpful to encourage them to participate in activities with friends and family and to be out in establishing relationships in the community. Next slide, please. Another key thing is to help them develop a safety plan, and that can include people they can call, places they can go, ways they can seek help, whether they decide to leave or if they stay. A lot of survivors say, I plan to stay with my partner, but if I notice these certain signs that always mean something's going to happen and it's going to build up, I'm going to go to my mother's house, for example. Having that kind of a plan and really thinking about ways to stay safe can be tremendously helpful. And one of the ways that can be done is by talking to people who can provide help and guidance. So certainly at the North Carolina Coalition, we're available. We also make a lot of referrals to the other domestic violence providers throughout the state. And anyone you know can certainly call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and they can help with safety. And one of the most important things is to remember that you can't rescue someone. They really need to make the decision to either leave or stay and be empowered to make the best choice for themselves. Next slide. So what if they do stay? What if someone you're assisting and talking with decides to stay? The most important thing really is that safety planning and to make sure they know what their options are. That they know that even though they might not feel like they want to leave now, that if they decide later that they're ready to leave or think that is the safest option, that they know where they can go and who they can reach out to. Next slide. So what do we do at NCCADV? Well, we do trainings about domestic violence. We are a statewide membership organization. We serve all 100 North Carolina counties. Our members are about 85 different domestic violence service providers throughout the state. Next slide. And our mission is to lead the state's movement to end domestic violence, to enhance work with survivors through collaborations, innovative trainings, prevention, technical assistance, state policy development, and legal advocacy. Next slide. So our main 4 branches are technical assistance, which means domestic violence service providers who have questions can always call us or send us an email and ask about things. So as you can imagine with COVID-19, if you're running a shelter, some of the questions are, how do we ensure that our shelter staff and the survivors that we're sheltering stay safe? How do we do support groups during times of social distancing? How do we do remote court advocacy when we have a survivor who's seeking a domestic violence protective order? Public policy, we look at whether or not laws that are being considered are looking at survivors and if there might potentially be some unintended consequences of some legislation. We train domestic violence service providers throughout the state. As you can imagine, if a service provider in the Appalachians is in a situation where they've got a staff of 8 and 2 of them are working late nights on weekends, it's hard for them to bring in a full-time trainer or have a full-time trainer on staff to train all of their people. So instead, they can send them to a central place, or we can travel there to train providers throughout the state about best practice and things that are changing and all of the legislation that's coming down the pipe. And again, programs. So the next slide talks a little about some of our programs. So we provide direct legal services in 3 counties where we accompany survivors to court proceedings around protective orders, divorce, and custody cases. We have programs that focus on teen dating violence and also advocating for children who have witnessed or have been exposed to domestic violence. We have a campus and college university program that looks at dating violence and also preventing sexual violence on college campuses. We do statewide data collection because the data really helps us to explain to people what's going on and also to make our case with legislators for changes to the law. A healthcare program that works closely with community health centers to screen when people come seeking healthcare around domestic violence issues. We provide services to a variety of special populations because each group needs culturally relevant services and different communities seek services in different ways. So we have a program around providing services to Latinx survivors, to African, Black, and Caribbean survivors, to LGBTQ survivors, and really anyone who needs assistance. And again, as I mentioned, we do training and technical assistance. We also focus on prevention. We have some innovative programs throughout the state working in the schools around preventing domestic violence. And then economic advocacy and economic justice, where we really look at the impact of financial control and power and how that frequently leads to a survivor staying in an abusive situation. So innovative programs that include savings matching. So as people save money to be able to leave, we have received some grant funding to help match those savings. So we're always looking at the best possible ways to serve survivors and to ensure that North Carolina is taking steps to end domestic violence in the state. Thank you. Any questions for us?
Yeah, I have a question if I can ask, and sorry if I cut off anyone. I felt like I heard somebody chime in at the last minute, but I wanted to know a little bit about how has technology impacted violence? So a lot of it was checking in, and I imagine that smartphones, social media applications have empowered even more the person who is committing these atrocities. And I wanted to know a little bit about how you all have changed what your approach is, given the technological advances that the perpetrators are now using.
What I would say is we certainly provide some training around tech abuse and share information with the various domestic violence service providers around that, because absolutely there have been survivors who have reported that they have a tracking app on their smartphone and that their abuser just shows up places when they've tried to leave. We are currently engaged in a campaign around COVID-19 with them, and potentially being tracked with it. So it's a huge thing. In social media, one of the things that has happened is there are, the domestic violence hotline allows texting for support and also allows live chat, because some people have found that they can go to a library, for example, and be on another computer, or right now one of the big things is going to a pharmacy and asking to use the phone there. Different ways to ensure safety. Kandace,
I would say a concern with the increasing use of technology is teen dating violence. We see a lot of teens using excessive text messaging as a means to control their partner. So before I even started law school, I was a community outreach and education coordinator with a domestic violence service provider in Durham. And I would go to high schools and speak with kids about healthy relationships. And it was amazing to hear oftentimes that young women would say, you know, when their partner would text them hundreds and hundreds of times a day, asking where they were, what they were doing, who they were with, they saw it as a sign of romance and concern, but really it's a sign of control and power. And so I think with, you know, younger folks having independence on cell phones, it can be a tool used for abuse and also control. And we also see cell phone use with sexting with teens as another means of power and control and abuse. If an abuser has videos or pictures that can be salacious for a victim, they can hold that over their head to get what they want.
We do have a question in the chat. How does your organization work with programs such as Interact, and how do you support each other?
Interact is one of our members. So we are one of the sources of support for Interact. So their staff attend our trainings. We're available to answer questions for them. Our public policy efforts certainly benefit the people who are served by Interact. So we work closely with them and with other domestic violence service providers throughout the state.
So I have a question. Y'all have done such a good job of providing sobering information about how hard it is to leave an abusive partner, and how oftentimes you try to leave and for so many different reasons you're not able to be successful. What are some of the signs? What does it normally take for someone to actually be able to break free and be able to stay away from that partner? I mean, what is this? Was it at about the seventh time that's different from the first six?
I'll start and answer, and Carrie Ann can follow up with her expertise. It takes time. I think relationships are complicated. People are complicated. And so that is why it takes time. It takes even more time when there has been a pattern of power and control over the lifespan of the relationship. And so it's not so much about wanting to live a life that is safe and healthy and happy, but if your resources are so closely linked to your abuser, it will be very difficult to leave. If you have children, it will be very difficult to leave. If you love that person, it'll be very difficult to leave. And oftentimes when an abuser asserts so much power and control over a victim, that individual doesn't feel like they have the capability or the power within to leave. And so it takes time to even develop that sense of empowerment, that sense of worth. And that is why having a supportive community of family, friends, and resource providers is critical, because that's what lays the groundwork for a survivor to feel empowered to make that decision. Because as Carrie Ann mentioned in her presentation, you know, no one can save anyone. It is up to the victim to leave. And it takes time to sort of dig out of that place of being abused, to dig out of that place of being disenfranchised by your partner. And so just human nature takes time, and it can be very complicated and complex for some folks. Carrie Ann, did you want to add in your experience? What do you think?
I would also say the most successful situations are when those barriers to leaving can be removed. So if part of the concern is, well, what about my children? Well, we can help you find housing and can provide those kind of services to make that happen. And we can help with some of the relationship building with friends and family. We can help with getting those medical appointments taken care of. All those little barriers that one by one, some of them may not seem like much, but when taken as a whole makes it really, really hard to get away and live independently. Addressing those barriers one by one really tends to help tremendously. But it's hard to do that when you're concerned, addressing those barriers in a way that's not safe while you're at home. If you are feeling like I can't pick up the phone and call this job I'm interested in because my abuser will know, then how do you address economic security? So addressing those barriers really one by one tends to be really.
Elsa,
right.
did you have a question?
I do. So I sat on the board of a couple domestic violence nonprofits back home in Michigan, so I'm pretty familiar with the topic. I guess my question for you would be, observedly, there's a lot of people who wouldn't even know a healthy relationship if it hit them in the head. So part of the teaching and education and resources about here is what a healthy relationship should look like. And then secondly, would you say that abusers and their victims find each other because they have some of the same psychological impediments? I'll call them impediments, for lack of a better word.
I think healthy relationships is definitely part of our programming and training materials. When I worked at a local service provider, like I said, I would often go to high schools around Durham County and talk to them about healthy relationships and consent. And it does start with younger folks, and it does even beyond healthy relationships. It also starts with dismantling problematic patriarchal values that oftentimes perpetuate unhealthy relationships and gender violence. And so I know NCC ADV does training around that, as well as other local agencies do training around that with youth, particularly with, identifying healthy relationships. I remember when I would do my trainings, one of the things that I would say is the fruit of a healthy relationship, does not look like jealousy. It does not look like control. That is not what a healthy relationship tree should look like. And so those conversations are being had, but absolutely for younger folks, it's very important. But even for folks who have found themselves in a abusive relationship for decades, it can often take time even after leaving the relationship to really understand what a healthy relationship should look like and feel like. And I think having support from a counselor would be very helpful for a survivor who's dealing with that. And with your second question, what was the second question?
Psychologically, do you see some similarities between the abuser and the victim?
I think you can see similarities. I think anyone could be a victim of abuse, honestly. And if we take ourselves out of that framework, like I can never be a victim of abuse, then you might honestly make yourself more susceptible to being victimized. And so I don't know if there's any one characteristic that makes someone a victim, but I think anyone can be a victim.
Thank you.
So thank you, Kandace, and thank you, Carrie Ann, for that very important and sobering presentation. I know I have learned a lot from hearing you, and you know, the big takeaway that I'm going to take from this is just as somebody that's living through a difficult time anyway, let's always just pay good close attention to our friends and take care of them. And being a good judgmental friend is always a start towards helping people with the situations they're in. So thanks to both of you for sharing today and for taking the time to come and talk to us today. As a small thank you for your presentation, we will be sending you the coveted Rotary mug. So when you are tired or you feel like you are short on energy, hopefully this will help you have some nice coffee to get your day going and continue doing the good work that you're doing. So thank you very, very much. I did want to go ahead and finish up the meeting with a couple of additional announcements that we didn't get to earlier. We want to wish a quick happy birthday to our friends with July birthdays this week. Bill Sigmund, July 9, Sevelyn Smith, the singer, July 10, George Merritt, July 12th, and also happy anniversary to Lewis and Sharon Rogers, whose anniversary is July 6th, and Frank and Debbie McNally, whose anniversary is July 9th. With that, we will close our meeting as we always do with the four-way test. Let us now repeat in unison of the things we think, say, and do.
Is it
Is
the
it the
truth?
truth?
Is it
Fair
fair
to
to
all
all
concerned?
concerned?
Will
Will
it
it
build
build
goodwill
goodwill
and
and
better
better
friendships?
friendships?
Will it
Be
be
beneficial to all concerned?
We are adjourned.
Aye, aye, Captain.
Thank you.
Nice to see everybody.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Same here.